Hi everyone, welcome to this paper, Soul Survivors, Women, Dissent and Northants, 1930 to 1990. This was presented as part of Northampton's Black Domestic Abuse Group's International Women's Day Conference 2025, and it's based on original PhD findings about Windrush and post-Windrush Northants. But it starts in 1930 because one of the questions I asked people when I was interviewing them was about what their parents and their grandparents and their extended family members were doing in the Caribbean before they came to Northamptonshire as well. So, when Marcia Walker's parents came to England in the 1950s, when she was 6 years old, she moved from a place called Duckenfield in Jamaica to Hampton Court in the parish of St. Thomas to live with her grandparents, who were called Alexander Nesbith and Francesca McDowell. On Wednesdays, she helped her grandmother grate coconut, and on Friday nights, Francesca sold coconut oil in the local village, and on Saturdays in the local market. For many people I interviewed, they have rural origins stories in the Caribbean of farming, livestock, land, and plantations. My grandmother's parents and my great-grandparents, Toyley and Edison Noel, were farmers in Grand Roy St. John in the parish of Grenada. My granddad's mum, so my other great-grandmother, Sita, was also a farmer and a market trader in that village. So you begin to get a sense of labour cultures of work that were instilled in some of the children before they came to Britain later on. My great-grandmother, Sita, was a mother of 11. So my great aunties, Rosie, Bets, Inez, Hazel, Tiny, Ven, Kay, and Louise, alongside my great uncles, Albert and John, and also my granddad, Sarge, in a time when large families was entirely normal, and it was the village's job to raise children as per the African proverb, it takes a village. So Sita went to market on Saturdays to sell produce like yams, sweet potato, and callaloo. She also ran a village shop, but there was also another shop run by her sister-in-law, Almina Ventour Grant, known in the family affectionately as Auntie Ellie, until Elmina's own death in 1960. Sita's shop is still in business and is now run by her daughter, Auntie Ven, who took it over on the death of her sister, Auntie Inez, who helped run it as a child and then later in adulthood until Auntie Inez's death in 2017. As Caribbean people started moving to Northants in the 1950s, women's labour was very much indispensable. Lace Jackson's mum, Francelle Coburn, arrived in Wellingborough from Jamaica and developed a long-standing relationship with the Asian community. In the 1960s, Sheila and Johnny Patel were running Kaka store, which I was told was on Gordon Road, and Francelle at some point worked there. In 1973, Kaka store moved to Northampton, and by 1980, it was located at number 9 Sheep Street. That spirit of entrepreneurship also lived in many white people, like Scottish woman Mrs. Geddes, who, on retiring in the early 70s, rented her shop to the Wainwright family from Jamaica, located on the cross between Victoria Road and Ecton Street. It later passed through many hands of Jamaicans, including Arthur Chambers, then Beryl Layden and her family, and by the late 80s, Janet Gordon's dad, Clarence Gordon. At that time as well, many black women played vital roles in the development of local health provisions. Many were nurses in Northampton at St. Crispin's, St. Andrews, St. Andrews Healthcare Mental Health Hospital, St. Edmunds, and also Barrett's Maternity Ward. In 1959, Grenadian Cynthia Aradinrin came to train at St. Andrews. Gladys Gordon worked at St. Edmunds as well, and remembers a manager keeping her in the waste room for 3 months. Mavis Bryan had similar experiences to Cynthia, later experiencing the institutionalized racism of Northampton Health Authority. likewise as well. Um, Hazel Dobbs arrived in Northampton from Jamaica in 1955 and worked as a nurse at St. Crispin's, also probably experiencing similar racism in the NHS. My granddad's sister, Auntie Rosie, was consistently denied promotion working at St. Edmunds. Hazel McClue worked at St. Mary's Hospital in Kettering during the 1970s, and she worked her way up to ward sister, experiencing relentless racism. Her daughter Heather told me at St. Crispin's, then she worked at Crispin's, then at Princess Marina in Dustin, then St. Mary's, where they saw fit to make her ward sister. Her experiences in the NHS was one of discrimination, racism continually, and just hard work, said Heather. Um, Many nurses went home to households uh, where they were experienced where they were expected to carry the care of both their children and their husbands. Sociologists Tracy Reynolds and Patricia Hill Collins show how community ideas of motherhood moved into networks of care. Black women have historically organised childcare in black communities. In Northampton during the 70s, there was a black children's nursery in the Eastern District. In the 1980s, Cherry Parkinson, along with Helen Williams, Nicola Petch, and Peggy Price, the latter so Cherry and Peggy, I think, both from Jamaica, ran a nursery on Clare Street for all children. These women-centered networks of care that we see in nursing and at nursery went to the very streets themselves in Abington's latched door neighbourhoods, where everybody's parents knew one another's children, which mirrors those rural communities on the Caribbean islands, where the village raises the child, like that African proverb. The reverse of this happened in local schools, on places where children were meant to be cared for and feel safe, was centre of one of the biggest scandals of abuse in British history. In 1965, the Race Relations Act led to the formation of a Community Relations Council, a CRC board. It greenlit funding to construct many community relations councils across the country, like in Northampton and Wellingborough. During the late 60s, a scandal began to brew that went to the heart of education policy. It was known as educationally subnormal. It effectively stated that some children had innately low intellect, and it disproportionately impacted Caribbean children. In 1971, a master's student from Grenada, Bernard Cord, exposed this scandal in his now landmark book, How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British School System. Implications showed up locally, for example, at Billingbrook School in Northampton, as well as Weavers and Croyland Primary School in Wellingborough. It's possible to see how the ESN scandal may have been a motivator for the formations also of community relations councils to get started. The story of the Victoria Centre by Mark Steinhardt tells us that white people like Cynthia Bailey remembers visiting also like local white activists, Brian and Denise Silk in Wellingborough in the early 70s, when they talked about the possibility of constructing Wellingborough Community Relations Council. It was the job of the CRCs at the time to basically look at racism issues, and locally that thinking around racism, anti-racism, began in little rooms in people's houses. By 1973, Northampton had a CRC, and a white woman, Sarah Berry, had taken a job there as an assistant. Sarah did a lot of work helping Caribbean people find housing, and now these Caribbean people were sending for their children to join them. This document here is Sarah lobbying the head teacher of Cliftonville Boys High School, Mr. Murby, to make changes to the provisions for black children. It is the equivalent of a very strongly worded email that lists out what schools should do, and basically still not being able to do it. Following the scandal, there was a lot of talk about black underachievement. And although there were children who found it difficult, many Bayesian children were ahead of the British system and thus were labelled by the system as backward, unable, uncooperative, so and so on. And we still see that today as well. So then you have black kids in classes where they're academically ahead and labelled as disruptive by the system that doesn't know how to teach them. Marcia Walker was the first black teacher in Northampton and came to Northampton in 1973 to teach at Cliftonville Boys High School. She was attracting attention, pushing boundaries, and that's how she met Sarah Berry. Black children in local schools had aspirations, but they weren't being set properly. As this was being collated by the CRC under Sarah's guidance, it was Sarah's idea that Northampton's black community start an organisation which in 1974 became the West Indian Parents Association. One of its first aims was to set up a Saturday school, which took place at Barry Road Primary School off the Wellingborough Road. Likewise happened in Wellingborough, running Saturday schools from home and having their own little gatherings, and then later in the 80s at Wellingborough African Caribbean Association on Rock Street, the WACA. In 1974, an elders project morphed out of the West Indian Parents Association at Dallington Church Hall, which later moved to the Holy Sepulchre Church on Sheep Street in the 80s and became the African Caribbean Elders Society, ACES. Its main aim was to deliver healthcare to elders who needed it, and the first elders were the grandparents of the Saturday school children whose needs were not being met by the NHS. Gwen White first coordinated it with the help of the community in the first 4 years. Many men also helped, further to women like Claudette Chambers and Kathy Marks. The late Olive Robinson was later the main contact, whose contribution included the publication of a book called Cold Arrivals, based on the experience of elders, not all of them from Northampton, which she wrote and researched with Steve Stevenson and Nikki Taylor. In May 1988, WACA, who were at Rock Street from 87, were also doing similar in Wellingborough with their elders when they got funding to start the Black Elderly Day Centre. So what these histories show is there's a lot of women's labour, both as individuals and as part of wider collectives. When Joyce Martin arrived in Northampton in 1961, women were told to carry pressing combs as there were few black hairdressers. Joyce Martin trained in black hairdressing in the United States during the late 70s, early 80s, and was always coming and going between there, opening her first salon in Northampton in 1982. She recollects that America was, and I quote here, the beginning of all my troubles, end quote, as now a lot of people only know her for hairdressing. Those who know her for hair do not see the intimacy of her struggles. Customers came to the shop to get their hair done, and some didn't trust her staff with their hair. Joyce soon saw that she had to get her staff officially trained. In the 80s, she didn't do white hair. Northampton had a lot of white hair salons, and some didn't admit black people. So it was a priority that black women had their own place to go. Joyce says, who wants to do white hair when you don't have anywhere for black people? I can do white people now, but I wasn't interested in white people. You have millions of hairdressing salon white people in Northampton that you couldn't even stand up at the door and look in, because you know what I mean. They look at you as if you're crazy, where you're going, sort of thing. What she had wasn't just a salon, but a community social space. She started hairdressing in her house before she got her own premises. She had people from Peterborough, Bedford, Milton Keynes, Luton, Scotland, Cambridge, Coventry, Leicester, even France at one point. Because across the country, there weren't that many black hair salons, even in the early 80s. So to put it another way, at that time, Joyce was very busy. She was consistently employed. So, meanwhile, Joyce's children are upstairs asleep. Next thing, Joyce's children get up to find strangers using the toilet. Joyce told me, and I quote here, "This is why I decided I had to get somewhere, because my house was being invaded, end quote." Because of Joyce Martin hair care, as it was called, pressure was later put on Northampton College to introduce black hairdressing courses. Joyce was eventually invited to to teach some seminars from around 1984. Simultaneously, local historical research was beginning in Black history. There was a lot of work being done in the background by people like Jenny LeBon. As early as 1982, Marcia Walker was also using the research that Black history people were doing at school in her teaching. So children benefited from the research done by local people. Around that time as well, there was a Mary Seacole exhibition that came to Wellingborough, facilitated by local activist Paul Crofts via his earlier links with researcher Ziggy Alexander, who went on to co-author the first book on Mary Seacole with Audrey Dadzie. You then had historian Dr. Julia Bush arriving in Northampton in 1987. She later worked with Alan Howard, producing the Moving On project about early Caribbean residents in the county. Around 1989, which is at the same time as Moving On, historian Peter Fryer came up from London to speak at a big public meeting at the Victoria Centre in Wellingborough about Black British history research in the area. Out of that meeting, local people formed Wellingborough Oral History Group, which was the predecessor organisation of the Black History Project of the early 2000s, and later the Northants Black History Association, which helped start the careers of people like Nikki Taylor and Anne-Marie Langford, as they did a lot of the community outreach and research alongside people like June Elizabeth White Smith Gully. Marcia was also involved at that time, and there were several men. It was a mixed affair, not just in terms of men and women, but also white and Black people doing the work. During the late 80s as well, Christine Thomas and the late Denise Silk set up a group for white single mothers of Black mixed children called Shades, operating from Service 6 on Rock Street in Wellingborough. Shades understood when Black women are included in groups like this, or I guess like social advocacy groups, they often become a resource rather than a group member. Shades was based on London research and was likely one of the first outside of a city of its kind. It also indirectly helped address anti-mixed racism as well. Barbara Nelson was one of the early mixed Caribbean kids in Northampton and remembers her mother, Phyllis Turner, facing racism for having mixed children, even from the late 1940s. Even as late as 1987, white women in Northampton that dated Black men caught the stray bullets. I'll describe them as the stray bullets of white male terror and aggression, the indirect racism of white men. After the 80s, especially with the arrival of Margaret Thatcher, telling after the 80s, and also prior with the arrival of Thatcher, telling people to think about the self over the collective, people began to embrace individualism. This goes against all this community spirit and collectivism that I've talked about already. There was a lot of trauma in the nursing homes, and nurses would cry in their rooms, but they had each other. Many probably also got sick from their experience. But now there's a lot of people coping alone, individually, rather than coping as on a united front in community. In 1990, Arline Geronimus coined the term weathering to take stock of the health disparities of newborns and their mothers due to lifetimes of racism and other forms of violence, including economic class warfare as we age, part of that intersectional oppression. What Patricia Hill Collins phrased fits right into how intersectional forms of violence accelerate illness, why women of colour are more susceptible to things like cysts and uterine fibroids than white women. A few weeks ago, I also interviewed my friend and local activist who's had a story on her experience of fibroids brought on by racism and her experience in the UK health system, the NHS. What started as small fibroids in early 2019 after her son was born, and later going into a job where she experienced the institutionalized racism of the organization, she was put through 18 months of medical gaslighting by the NHS that resulted in her fibroids growing to 22 centimeters. Her experience as a woman cannot be split from that as a brown woman, because how she is received by others is as a brown woman. including doctors, that may not take her pain as seriously as a white woman. Black women too have similar yet different experiences as racism shapes realities. Susanna is of Sri Lankan heritage and would be racialized as South Asian. So she is received differently than black women, women of African descent, who under white supremacy are coded differently to South Asian women. Susanna may also have been saved um, by the virtue of biology as well, in that sense. Reportedly, it is much better to have a woman's immune system when fighting disease and illness. Women are better survivors, according to Angela Saini's book Inferior. Science journalist Angela Saini, informs us that the female immune system is better equipped to survive disease, including those that are worsened by forms of discrimination and other forms of terror. So for black women, like those who worked as nurses and doing the work in the community, carrying the load, the trauma, the emotional baggage, they're also carrying the terror their ancestors experienced. As we think about black women abused and killed by police, so Sarah Reed, Joy Gardner, in the same shadow of the slave master, those killed by disease, as the vector through which white supremacy can also be carried, Betty Mujinga, and women migrants, while black, fleeing zones of terror made by the West, then coming to the West terrorized, or to be killed in a public park, and open spaces made for male citizenship, Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry. These ideas of abuse and violence reinforce not only borders outwards, but inwards, and how borders cut us up internally. So racism shapes outcomes. Much in that way, I stumbled upon the history of a woman called Kate Tate, who was a Northampton medical activist. Kate founded Northampton Cancer Therapeutic Day Centre, and this article from 1988 is all about cancer patients having long waits for treatment, showing not a lot has changed since. Tate was also an ex-nurse and also a twice survivor of cancer. Her work gives a historical grounding to the work of today's Lewis Foundation, where Lorraine follows in the trail of Kate, while also making her own legacy as well. Although both Kate and Lorraine do not exclusively help black cancer patients, but anyone that has cancer, regardless of race and so on, black women death rates from cancer are significantly higher than white women, partly with breast cancer, for example, more likely to be diagnosed at a later stage, which may show that racism exists earlier down the line when trying to be seen by a doctor and taken seriously. Christina Sharp's book In the Wake discusses a lot of this in the US context, but British history is littered with examples of violent practices made to exclude black and brown people from citizenship, which hits women of colour twofold, both by gender and race. So you are bodying the physical violence while also taking on the colonial histories that have happened and are still happening. Toni Morrison coined the term rememory to talk about the way we take on ancestral trauma and how our dreams may be the memories of ancestors long dead as well, as history reaches out like a gentle hand out of the grave. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, if you're looking for more information, I've done numbers of videos on my PhD research, which you can find on the channel as well. And there's one article here, which I'll put in the description, Black Lives in the Sticks, Caribbean Northants and Dissent in Black London on screen, 1948-85. And if you've got comments and questions, just leave them in the comment section, or you can send me an email as well, treyventour.com/contact, and that will take you to the contact form and just fill out the form. Thanks very much.